In this video, I'm going to teach you some of the most useful business English expressions that you need to communicate effectively in the workplace, especially for meetings, for proposals, for presentations. If you have any questions as we go, let me know in the comments. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. And now, let's get into the video. Let's talk about some phrases we can use. Business English phrases for meetings, for presentations. I just want to share a few useful things that you might need for different situations when you're in meetings or perhaps when you're giving a presentation. All right? So let's get into it. We're going to start with asking for input. How can we ask for input? When we're having a meeting, we have an idea, we want to know what other people think, right? How do we get other people's thoughts, essentially? So here are a few we could use. You could simply say, what are your thoughts on this? Now, what's different between what are your thoughts on this and what do you think? What are your thoughts on this is kind of suggesting that people give a bit more, that they explain what they think, they explain their opinion, right? So that's the difference in feeling. The connotation is more, tell me what you think, but also explain what you think. Give me a bit of detail on that, right? Maybe you're talking to a group of people or you've given a presentation on something and you want to know, you want to get feedback or ideas, and you've heard from one or two people, but 8 people are here and they haven't said anything. Would anyone else like to weigh in? This is also useful in a meeting situation when one person is talking a lot and you haven't heard from others, and so you want to invite others to give their opinions. To weigh in is to give your opinion, is to share your thoughts, and again, probably to support those thoughts, right? To say, this is what I think and this is why I think it. So weigh in can be very useful. You can, of course, use it in all kinds of situations. You could use it when you're talking to one person. You haven't weighed in on this yet. Or can I weigh in? Very useful phrase. I love to hear your perspective is similar, but it's kind of inviting someone in a really welcoming way to get them to open up when maybe they haven't said anything, right? So your perspective, your viewpoint to explain, it's sort of an inviting, very open expression that we can use. And it's less, I guess, less pushy than saying, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts is like saying, I want you to start speaking, right? I love to hear your perspective is inviting you to do that, but it's not being too pushy, right? I love to hear your perspective. I love to hear your thoughts. I love you to weigh in. It's not being overly pushy because of that I love part at the beginning. Now, again, talking to a group, we could say, any feedback on this one, right? That doesn't mean there has to be, but I just want to know if anyone has thoughts based on what I said or showed people. Any feedback? Any feedback? That is a little informal, right? It's not like saying, would you? Would you is a little formal feeling. Would anyone else like to weigh in? Any feedback is pretty direct, pretty straight. And this is for people who know each other well, honestly. I know my team well. I know these people well. And I just want to get straight to the point. I want to cut to the chase. Any feedback? Right? That's actually very common in the workplace. What's your take? This is where you're asking someone directly for their opinion. And it's kind of like they have to answer. I don't want to know if you want to give an opinion. I want to know what your opinion is. Tell me, basically. It's not as direct as tell me your opinion, but it's kind of the closest one to that. Now, let's talk about options. How can we give different options? So if you've been asked to weigh in or you've been asked to give your thoughts about something, you might explore different ideas, different possibilities. So you might, if someone has suggested something, say, alternatively, we could consider. So everyone seems to agree, but I have a difference of opinion with everyone, and I just want to make sure that people know that this is not the only path, that it's not the only way, There might be another way. That could be an alternative. An alternative. This is a really useful word. So alternatively is a form of that alternative is a noun, right? Alternatively is a form of that word to let people know, hey, I'm talking about something else now, another option now, right? Sometimes we can use a conditional. This is an if statement. If you care most about quality, this is only the first draft, so let me get back to you, right? If there's no rush, then we could maybe bring in a few more resources. If something, then something. So if statements allow you to say, there are options. We could do A, B, or C. If you want A, this is complicated. If your requirement is A, we could do B. If your requirement is E, we could do D, right? So it's sort of depending on what you think, or depending on your standard or your criteria, we could take different actions. If we're in a hurry, we could probably just finish this version the best that we can and then put it out. If there's no rush, I like to hire a few more people, okay? So depending on what you think, right? Another option would be, so if you have another option, it's like saying alternatively, but it's a little less formal, right? Another option would be to mention it without being too pushy, right? And here's one, and here's one, and here's one. Another option, right? And in the same way, a very sort of non-pushy way to say it would be, well, we may want to look into. We may want to look into hiring a few more people. We may want to look into adjusting the budget. We may want to look into how we do quality control, whatever it happens to be. This is a suggestion that I'm putting out there, and I'm not being too pushy with it, okay? What about agreement and disagreement? Now, these can actually be used for both, not all of them, but let's say that's a valid point. That's a valid point could be to agree, or to say, I didn't think about that before, and then continue the conversation. Someone mentioned something I didn't think about before, and that's a valid point. That doesn't mean I agree 100%. That means that you're not crazy for saying that. Now we can discuss it further. I could also use it to disagree, though. That's a valid point, but. So often adding but or although after some agreement, or at least giving someone credit for what they said, can be a kind of good way to continue the conversation, even if you don't agree, right? It kind of shows people that you're listening. Oh, that's a good point. However, right? But if you want to agree strongly, then we use things like absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I don't disagree at all. You could say I don't disagree, but that one's not as common. Strong agreement. We can say I agree. We can say absolutely. Sometimes we say 100%. We more often say 100% rather than 100%. 100%. 100%. That means I totally agree. And you can say, I totally agree. Or no doubt. I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying. No doubt, and sometimes no doubt about it. Now, for those, it would be hard to then disagree. But for these next ones, we could then turn it around to disagree, or rather the next two. We could turn them around and disagree. I see where you're coming from. That could be used as general agreement, like, yeah, I understand. I see where you're coming from. That's a good point. Or right before I disagree, to show you that I'm listening, to show you that I'm paying attention. I see where you're coming from, but now I'm going to say the thing that is against you, right? I see where you're coming from. However, I'm not sure if we can afford that, okay? Where you're coming from is your perspective, your opinion. And a perspective is often more general than a simple opinion. It is a way of thinking, and that way of thinking is what you bring into this discussion or this debate. And I understand it, I see it, but based on my perspective, maybe I have a different opinion, okay? And in the same way, well, I get what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I get it. I get it is a way to empathize, right? If someone expresses a feeling and you say, I get it. You're empathizing with that view. You're empathizing with that perspective. While I get what you're saying, this is a great way to set up disagreement. You could say simply, I get what you're saying, but, or you could use while at the beginning, and that accomplishes the same thing that but does. While I get what you're saying, we have to consider the cost, right? This could be a very expensive thing that we're going to do, right? That means whatever you just said, I understand it. I was listening. However, but. Now, a straight disagreement, we could say, I disagree. Some people feel that's too direct. Fair enough. You might instead say, I beg to differ. That's like saying, I disagree. It's a different way to say it, right? I think it's fine. It's a little bit more formal than saying, I disagree. Now, what about at the end? What about when we're done, right? We want to either move on to the next topic or end the meeting or end the presentation or whatever it is, right? Let's say it's a meeting. We've made some decisions throughout. We've agreed, we've disagreed on things. I want to just make sure we're all on the same page. So I'll say, okay, let's recap. To recap is to go over what we have already talked about. If there are any decisions, if there are any important things to keep in mind, right? That is a recap, to go over and sort of repeat some of the important things, okay? Now, if we're just on a topic and we're going to go on to the next one, we would say just to wrap up on this topic. So that means maybe I have a final comment to make, a last little thing I want to say, right? To wrap up is to finish something, but wrap it up means to finish something not suddenly, but to finish it in a way that everyone feels like, okay, I understand what's going on, right? So just to wrap up on this topic would be to neatly end it so that everyone feels like everything makes sense, everything is in order, we don't have any lingering questions, and then we move on to the next one. Okay, let's just wrap up this meeting and we can meet on the same thing tomorrow and finish the conversation. So wrap up could just be to finish. It's one way to just say finish it. But again, usually it has this connotation of being in a somewhat organized way rather than very abruptly ending things, right? Anything else on this before we move on? To move on is to go on to the next topic, to go on to the next thing. So this is not the end of the presentation. This is not the end of the meeting. This is, I'm ready to go on to the next point, the next topic, the next agenda item. And before we do that, I want to know if there are any questions. So if this is an interactive presentation I'm giving, I stop every so often to make sure people understand what I'm saying. You understand? Oh, you had a question. I answer your question. Anything else on this before we move on? No? No? Okay. Then I keep going, right? So I just want to check to see if people understand, right? We also in a meeting might have, less so for a presentation, action items. These are things that people will need to do, specific things. I need to do, you need to do, Sheila needs to do, right? So let's just go over the action items we have for this meeting. Let's recap the action items. We've talked about them throughout, but I want to make sure that everyone remembers what they are. These are usually the action items. Now, what if I say, let's call it a day? I think we can call it a day. That means we're finished for the day. So if you're in a long meeting and it's toward the end of the day and everyone's tired, even if you're not finished with everything, right? You're trying to make some very important decisions. You're trying to brainstorm and come up with good ideas, whatever it is. 6 p.m., people are getting hungry. I need a glass of wine, whatever. I think we can call it a day. Let's call it a day. So that means we're going to come back tomorrow, or if it's Friday, we'll come back on Monday and we'll continue on this same thing. But we have stopped for today. It's not a permanent end. Usually it's time to stop no matter what we're doing because it's late, because we're hungry, because we're tired, because our brains are fried, and we can get a fresh start tomorrow. A fresh start means we can look at things in a slightly new way because we slept and we had breakfast and we had some coffee, right? So often it's just about ending the day, but then continuing that later, okay? So if you have any questions about any of these sentences, these are very common for workplace English, for meetings, for presentations. If you have any questions about how to use these, let me know. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and also get a free course, natural English conversations in the links in the description.